5 Live Formula One.
Welcome to the F1 paddock here at the Marina Bay Street Circuit in Singapore, and we've just watched qualifying, and it was Carlos Sainz in the Ferrari backing up his performance in Monza, taking consecutive poles. The first time he's done that in his career, and he pipped George Russell in the Mercedes to pole by just over 700ths, and it will be Charles Leclerc starting from third in the second Ferrari. We will get on to those three drivers very shortly, but the big news here in Singapore this evening is that Max Verstappen and his teammate Sergio Perez failed to make it through into Q3. They will not be starting in the top 10. Don't forget, this was a weekend that they could have wrapped up the Constructors' Championship. That feels a little far-fetched right now. Max will start at the moment from P11. He's still got to go and see the stewards, and Checo will start from P13. So, to talk through that qualifying session, I'm joined by our lead commentator, Harry Benjamin, racing driver Alice Powell, and the BBC Sports chief F1 writer, Andrew Benson. I mean, Andrew, we came into this weekend thinking that Max Verstappen would be the one to beat. Red Bull sort of measured our expectations, I think, told us not to get too excited. And then Max Verstappen doesn't make it through into Q3. What happened?
Well, I hate to start the podcast with something really boring, Rosanna, but there's always a technical explanation for these things. And, I don't think anybody saw this coming, but there were signs before the weekend that Red Bull might
see what you did
Singapore.
there. See what you did there. Signs. I see what you did there, Andrew Benson.
I didn't even know I was doing it, Rosanna. There you are. That Red Bull might find this weekend more difficult than most, and they did even say that themselves. And that's the way it's transpired. And it's all to do with the way the car works. Okay, it's been the fastest car in Formula One this year, all year. It's still on balance the fastest car. It's probably going to be the fastest car in the race tomorrow, I would imagine. But where its advantage in the race is much bigger than its advantage in qualifying. And that's to do with how it's so gentle on its tyres. And when you have a track like Singapore, which has A, a low abrasion track surface, B, short duration corners, then it's hard to get the tyres up to temperature. And that's what it appears. That's what Red Bull suspect is what's happened. On top of that, trying to chase their tyre temperatures, they've made a mistake with the setup, and obviously in qualifying the car was run too low as well. Add that all up, and you get 11th and 13th places on the grid, and that's even before the penalties that might be coming.
It just seems crazy, though, because Harry Benjamin, sorry to call you out on this, whilst you said you thought Carlos Sainz would be on pole, you kind of kept alluding, as we all did, to the fact that Max Verstappen and Red Bull always turn it around. Of course they do, and as Andrew's alluded to, even though they weren't top of the timesheets in the practice sessions, the data kind of suggested that they'd be strong and sort of there or thereabouts. But you thought they'd come good, didn't you?
I was hedging my bets, Rosanna. I was hedging my bets.
Is that fence you've been sitting on all weekend long?
I didn't want to commit. But can you blame me? Because if you look at historical data from this year, Verstappen often has issues with upshifts and downshifts in FP1 or FP2, but they're always sorted by the Saturday of a Grand Prix weekend, and then they come good. Perez, has his own thing going on, up and down, but Verstappen always seems to come good. But as Andrew highlighted right there, it hasn't come good for them, and the signs were there from the very start, with both Ferraris being very quick over one lap pace. The Ferrari is good in mid corners, in mid speed corners. They are very, very good, and there are a fair few corners around here. There aren't many long straights where Red Bull can really utilise their power, their straight line speed. It's a tricky track to get the temperatures right into your tyres, as we've already discussed, which was one thing Red Bull was struggling with, and then that just seemed to get worse and worse, actually, as we went into qualifying. And then on the other side of it, Ferrari and Sainz hasn't really put a foot wrong all weekend, whereas Leclerc had to have a couple of goes sometimes at his fast laps where he made a mistake, locked up slightly. Sainz has been on it from the start, and once again, unlike in Monza, where we've discussed, he had a bit of help he got the benefit of a tow to secure pole position. This time around, he was outright faster, and he was the man whose pole position it was to lose come Q3.
The thing is, Yeah, sure. I'm buying what you're selling. Ferrari were faster than Red Bull. Cool. Mercedes, yeah, make note of that and mark that in your diary. Ferrari's faster. Sure, I agree. McLaren faster. Mercedes faster. But hang on a second, we've got Liam Lawson, third race weekend, and he's out-qualified Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez in the junior, sister, whatever you want to call it, team of Red Bull, that AlphaTauri. He has done better than the two-time world champion in the RB19. So surely, Alice, this is actually bigger than just them, not hooking it all up.
I think
Verstappen's under pressure, right? Lawson's going to take his place sooner or later.
Yeah. Imagine that. Imagine the scenes. No, I think Red Bull, they've just not got it this weekend. For some reason, they just haven't got the car working at this circuit in these conditions. It's just not going straight forward for them. I think Tsunoda would have probably been up there and we would have seen Lawson not into Q3 if he didn't have that lock-up into turn 14, because he was looking pretty good. But the AlphaTauris looked fairly good all weekend. But for whatever reason, the Red Bull is not suiting this track this weekend. It looks a handful. It looks not very nice to drive at any point throughout the corner. So I would say it's just down to that. But, no wonder Harry was sort of sitting on the fence there, because you can never write Red Bull out. But I think for the race, it's going to be extremely tough for them to come forward tomorrow and to win the race. It's going to be very tricky.
Do we think there's a little bit of pressure to take that Constructors' Championship? Andrew, is that playing on their minds? We know that they've sort of brushed records and numbers aside quite often, but this is a big deal to take the Constructors' Championship, and perhaps they've already got the T-shirts printed and there's a little bit of stress and pressure mounting.
Well, I'm sure they've got the T-shirts printed because that's the way Formula 1 teams do things these days, but no, I don't think that's had anything to do with it
They've
at all.
had that since Miami.
Yeah, exactly. The Red Bull don't work in that way. There's such a bunch of good operators. It's just a fact of they've just not got the car sorted this weekend, and maybe it's not possible to get the car sorted this weekend. Now, it's not the first time they've been beaten to pole this year. Don't forget, Lewis Hamilton got pole in Hungary, Carlos Sainz got pole in Monza, Charles Leclerc got pole in Baku. And Baku and Monza have very similar characteristics to Singapore in the sense that they've got short duration corners, 90 degree, and lots of them. And so, as I say, we couldn't have seen this coming, but to look forward to the race, I do think Verstappen will have good pace in the race, although the fact that the car was set too low is a potential problem for him because they can't change the car. So and if they do change the car, he's going to go to the back of the grid, which they're certainly not going to want to do. But in Singapore, as we saw with Red Bull last year when Verstappen qualified 7th after they made a team tactical error in qualifying, you just can't make progress from that sort of place. It's just too hard to overtake. The track has changed slightly this year, but I'm not sure it's changed enough to make enough of a difference. So even if he does have the quickest car, I can't see him making progress. The only caveat to that is if it's wet, then all bets are off, because if it's wet but the track is in suitable condition to run the race, Verstappen's so good that maybe just maybe he could pull something off. Without that, I think this winning run is coming to an end tomorrow evening.
I think his winning run, I'm totally with you. I think it's coming to an end.
Well, I tell you something, there is 70% chance of rain tomorrow in Singapore, but it will probably have cleared before the race gets going. Although, as Alice spoke about during the practice sessions, it takes a long time to dry up here. But of course, there's other factors: race neutralisation, virtual safety cars, the walls are tight here. It is a twisty and tricky track. Max Verstappen described his car after FP3 as unacceptable. Let's hear how he described his qualifying session to me earlier on in the media pen.
I mean, FP3 I think was already a little bit better. I think we were heading in the right direction, actually. But then we changed a few more things, thinking that we could do it in the setup, it would allow us, but it ended up being, I think, too aggressive, where I was just sliding around a lot in every corner. Lost a lot of front grip as well. Every time in the big braking zones I was bottoming out a lot, so that was then unloading the front tires. So then I couldn't really hit the brakes like I wanted to. I basically had to do like a really gentle approach, otherwise the car would go down too much, and that doesn't work on a street circuit. So yeah, it was really, really difficult.
So that was Max Verstappen talking to me earlier on. He doesn't rate his chances of advancing through the pack come tomorrow evening, Singapore Grand Prix. And on a day where Max Verstappen is not firing all cylinders, Alice, you might think his teammate Sergio Perez would come through and be in the top 10 or be on the front row or even pole position. And yet, he is not. He's starting behind Max Verstappen. Another opportunity wasted, or just another example of how difficult this car is to drive on this particular circuit?
I think it's just another example of how difficult the car is to drive on this circuit. We saw he had a spin at the end of Q2 which totally ruined any chance of him leapfrogging Max, getting into the final qualifying session. He was complaining a lot of the rear locking going into corners. We've got some heavy braking zones at this track, and especially on a bumpy street circuit with heavy braking zones, the last thing you want as a driver is to just not have the confidence in the rear at all. So it's not been a great day for them, and I can't see it really improving that much in the race.
And they are running, as we've mentioned, the Red Bull cars lower, and I think that is one of the crux of the issues here, because it is a bumpy track, and that is upsetting the car. It's a track that doesn't play to either strengths of the Red Bull, and I think that's highlighted actually at a track where Perez, I think, came in as a bit of a street king, showing that if Perez can't do it, and Verstappen, Red Bull have got a problem.
Why have they lowered the car then on a street where we know it's bumpy and tricky like that?
Well, that's a really good question.
Well, they were struggling for grip, Rosanna, in the final practice session, and the usual way, one of the ways of getting extra grip is to lower the car with these ground effect cars. That gives you more downforce, and you get more downforce, you get more temperature in the tyres. Then the tyres heat up into the correct working window. Suddenly, you can have a virtuous cycle, but the risk is that you lower the car, you get into a situation where it bottoms on the track, over bumps and so on, and that seems to be what's happened. So basically, what's happened is that with a car that's not particularly well suited to the track, Red Bull have also made some operational engineering mistakes, and these things happen when you have a car that's not that well suited to the track, because you're chasing your tail.
And also, with lowering the rear of the car, if you're struggling with rear locking, that can also make it a little bit worse as well. So yeah, they said they can't make the changes, otherwise they do get a penalty, but maybe Max is at that point where he's like, well, I'm starting out of the top 10, I don't really care, let's make those changes to try and move forward. Doubt that he will say that, but we know what Max can sometimes think sometimes.
He's come back through the field before in Singapore. I think he stalled his Toro Rosso there back in 2017, I think I want to say, and was plumb last and managed to finish ahead of his teammate then, Carlos Sainz, well in the top 8. And if anyone can crawl their way back, it'll be Max Verstappen. But I think it is this lowering of the floor of the car. That could be one of the main issues around why Red Bull have suddenly dropped their performance.
We're going to take a short break now, and after that we will talk about our pole sitter, Carlos Sainz. So another good weekend for Carlos Sainz, with the opportunity to convert pole position to the win. Last time out in Italy, he had Max Verstappen breathing down his neck. This time, obviously, Max is out of the picture, but we're also on a street track, Alice, and it's impossible to overtake. So is he just looking ahead, eyes front, and not worrying about anyone overtaking? This is his race victory to lose, isn't it?
It is his race victory to lose, but this is Singapore. It's hard to overtake, but it can be fairly tricky to get off the line as well. And also there's other factors that can come into it. You've mentioned about the rain possibly, but I think it will be cleared by the time the race comes. The safety cars, there's so many different elements, and we have taken out that section between 15 and 16. They haven't added an extra DRS zone, whereas a few drivers called for it to come in. So he just needs to get it off the line, but it can be so tricky to make mistakes here with the bumps, with the walls so close to you that one slight error and you run slightly wide offline. It is dusty offline. There's no question about it. It's very dusty offline. So if you do make a small mistake, and then that then allows the car behind you to get on top of you, get under your gearbox, that puts you under pressure, and it's a warm race. You know what it's like there in Singapore at the moment. It's hot. It's a long race. It's probably the toughest, I would say. Yeah, it is the toughest on the calendar in terms of it as the physical side of things for the drivers with the heat. So it's not as straightforward as we're maybe all thinking. He'll say first task, getting it off the line. But then you've got to keep the car on the track and you've got to keep that concentration. It's a long, long race and there's still a lot of things that can go wrong.
The strategy side of things as well is going to be so crucial. And we know Ferrari with their strategy can be a bit hit or miss.
Yes.
There's been a safety car intervention at every single Singapore Grand Prix. It is likely we'll see another one. Well, they now said it. I bet you anything it will be the first clean race they've ever had. But you've got to be able to call that in the moment. Do you pit? Do you not? And equally, it's a bit of luck. If there's an incident and the safety car is called out and Carlos Sainz has just gone past the pits, then he's done for.
The other thing to bear in mind is tyres again. I hate to come back to that, but George Russell in second place has got 2 new sets of medium tyres for the race, and most other people have only got 1. Now, in a normal race, if it's only 1 stop, which it will be if it's not a safety car, that wouldn't make any difference because they'll probably all start on the mediums and then change to the hards for the remainder of the race. But if a safety car comes into play, then Russell has a new set of tyres to go with, which no one else has. That means extra grip, and that could be a really crucial advantage. It might not end up meaning anything, but it might. It's just an extra equation to add into the race, an extra threat for Sainz.
More jeopardy then, more jeopardy. So Alice, as you're lining up on that grid, come the start of the Singapore Grand Prix, where do you go as a pole sitter? We've seen it get fairly chaotic off the start before. Does he go wide? Does he go for the apex? How does he make sure that George doesn't jump him off the start?
Well, it's all about judging your start perfectly. He's got to get a clean getaway off the line. I think we saw last year, I know it was wet conditions, but Max Verstappen bogged and was swamped by the pack last year. So he doesn't want to risk that. He can't afford to have that because he will then drop right into the pack. So he needs to get a clean start. I think that's really, really important. Getting that clean start off the line, and then you have a little look in your mirror and you've got to decide, do I move slightly to the left? Have I got that gap to Russell or whoever it might be that's got a start and is up behind him? You're better off covering it just in case someone does send one down the inside. It's a risk to go around the outside if you do go side by side there. We've got that sausage curb, haven't we, there at turn 2. I think it's always so difficult to plan your start because 9 times out of 10 there's going to be some element there that's going to be different to what you've planned. I think you've got to just have your options open. He's done plenty of starts in his career. He got a really nice launch at the last one, so he should be confident with his starts. So I would say he just needs to focus on getting a clean launch off the line, and if he does make it through turn 1, turn 2, he's just got to hit all his apexes, make sure he keeps that Ferrari in check and in a straight line to try and open a gap before the DRS zones are wide open.
They've got to be careful though, because if you cast your minds back to 2017, where Ferrari were 1 and 3 on the grid with Vettel and Raikkonen, both getting, I think Raikkonen got a great start, but Verstappen was in the middle, and Vettel bogged slightly off the line. Vettel comes across to try and defend, but then he's got a Red Bull on his inside, and then the other Ferrari was on the inside of the Red Bull, and that led to a huge incident for those 3. So Sainz and Ferrari got to be careful that if Sainz does get a bad start, he's got to be careful if it doesn't come swinging across to the inside.
Yeah, and it's hard to see out of those mirrors. They're not easy to see. Everyone said, well, they moved over. They're hard to see. You can't just turn your head left or right, especially travelling at those speeds as well. And the view is restricted, like we said earlier, coming out of the pit boxes. It's hard to see. You've got the hands device on, which restricts your movement of your neck anyway. And plus the headrests these days are so high, you can't see. So he's better off covering the line. But again, it all depends of how everyone else is launching. He can only concentrate on himself and do the best job possible of making sure he gets the absolute perfect start.
But Rosanna, this is what happens when you take Verstappen and Red Bull out of it. You get a proper unknown fight on our hands.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how it's all going to play out. So let's hear how Carlos is feeling. How is he going to convert that pole position to the win?
A good start and a good first stint and good tire degradation, good tire management and a good pit stop. I think if we nail all those 3 or 4 things, then we have a win in our hands to go for. No, but it's not going to be easy. I still think it's going to be a tough fight. But yeah, like always, race day, we always tend to look a bit in our mirrors instead of look forward. Tomorrow we have a good opportunity and we're going to try and nail it.
Something's clicked. Can you pinpoint where it's clicked, when it clicked?
No, for me it's always incremental gains. It's not suddenly you find something and you go quicker. It's just putting everything together. And if you remember before Sunboard, I said that this second half of the season I wanted to make sure that I start putting weekends together and put everything that I've learned in the first half together in the second half. And I knew we had the potential. It's just that now I'm finally able to extract all of it, and it's been 2 very clean weekends, 3 if you count Sunboard as one, because I thought I was quite good there. So yeah, it seems like all those analysis and understanding is now paying off, and I'm driving to the level that I know I'm capable of.
You wanted that, so have you brought the team around you, do you feel?
No, I just know what I need more or less from the car, what I need to do with my driving, and I put it on the setup or in my driving, and it works. It's just you have a bit more time during the summer to think clearly and know exactly what you're going to test, what you're going to put, and that's it. But the team has always been on my side, has always been in Charles' side, and it's just me with my group of engineers trying to understand the little details.
It does feel, doesn't it, like Carlos Sainz has found a new confidence. He's wrapping that team around himself. Do we have a new number one, or is he just sort of reaffirming and reasserting his position in the team?
I don't think we have a new number one. I think Ferrari would be very, very careful not to label anybody as a number one. The de facto, of course, is Charles Leclerc, who is the Ferrari, star. Protégé, that's the word, thank you. I was going to go for star, but protégé is better. He came up through the Ferrari Academy. They placed him into, at the time, Sauber and then Alfa Romeo. Sauber when he was coming into Formula One, and then obviously promoted him into that seat alongside Vettel to eventually take the mantle. Sainz coming in, I think it's clear he's not as quick on outright pace as Charles Leclerc, but has that gap closed, I wonder, over this season? He's been the more consistent driver, I think it's fair to say, but Leclerc has the higher peaks, but the lower falls.
I think that's fair to say. I mean, Leclerc's also had some bad luck. Remember, he lost 3rd place in Bahrain with an engine failure, which has had knock-on effects in subsequent races. He's still quicker on balance in qualifying than Sainz, but I think it's 3 races in a row now that Sainz has done him in qualifying, which probably accounts for Leclerc looking a bit grumpy after the session. He actually was. Alice and I were watching his mini sector times as he was going through his final lap, and at one point on the sort of end of the 2nd sector into the 3rd sector, his live lap time was showing purple, which means he was about to go pole. But then it looks like he made a little mistake somewhere around the last corner, maybe the last chicane, and it just fell away from him by just under 800. So he'll be really annoyed about that. But look, Leclerc's an incredible talent. He's not a fully rounded driver by any imagination. One thing to say about the race tomorrow, and this is going to be an unusual race because it's an unusual circuit that has unusual characteristics, but Leclerc's usually stronger on a race run than Sainz. Ferrari as a team have struggled with tyre wear all year, although it's been getting better, but Sainz has struggled more than Leclerc, and quite often you will see him drop away from Leclerc in races. Now, Singapore's the sort of track where if he's ahead, that won't matter because he'll be able to control the field. But remember a few years ago, there was a Ferrari strategy error. They were 1-2 on the grid there with Leclerc ahead of Vettel, and they pitted Leclerc first, as you would do, and expecting that he would come out first, and they would run 1-2 to the flag. They ended up inadvertently undercutting Vettel ahead of Leclerc, which caused a bit of a storm inside the team. So there's the race is there for Sainz to win, but as we've already talked about with Russell, there's a threat, and if he has high tyre degradation, Sainz, then Leclerc's a threat too.
Team orders in play at some stage?
I don't think they'll use team orders at the beginning. I wouldn't rule out team orders happening, but let's just cast our mind 2 weeks ago. They went at it hammer and tongs, and Sainz on the final lap particularly was right on the edge of acceptability in terms of his defensive driving against his teammate. And Fred Vasseur, the team principal, who's a racer, he let his instincts flow that day. So I don't see any real reason why he won't do that again on Sunday in Singapore.
So Charles Leclerc starting from P3 on the second row, and ahead of him, behind Carlos Sainz, is George Russell in the Mercedes. Let's hear from George then and find out if they can win from P2 on the grid.
Oh, we can definitely win tomorrow. I think the team are putting so much hard work in. We're making good gains. We know Ferrari are always quick in qualifying, especially on street tracks with a C5 tyre. Obviously, Red Bull are the odd ones out. You know, it's strange to see why they're so far off the pace. But nevertheless, you know, even on a normal weekend, would have been top 3 and in a great place to fight for a good podium. Now, fighting for victory.
So that was George Russell talking to me in the media pen a little earlier on, out-qualifying Lewis Hamilton. And it seems, guys, that George has had the upper hand on Lewis Hamilton all weekend long. And yet, we always think Lewis Hamilton quite enjoys this track and goes quite well. So George really finding something this weekend.
Yeah, he came alive in kind of FP3, really, didn't he? This will be his first front row start as well since Australia. 12 races ago, but really since the summer break, Russell has found something again with this Mercedes. I think it's hard to call it a rough patch, but he did have a few bad qualifyings. Hungary springs to mind as well, Austria too, where he wasn't blending with the car. And this concept of car, the Mercedes openly admitted they've gone the wrong way. They've scrapped the whole zero side pod thing from earlier in the year, and they're going to be looking for a new concept and have gone down a new concept route for the rest of this year and next year beyond. But they are still adapting to it, and Russell seems to have managed to flick a switch, and it's come towards Russell more and seems to have slipped a little bit away from Hamilton on the other side. I mean, they're neck and neck. We're talking fine margins here, but Russell has the edge.
Yeah, well, it's been 7-7, isn't it? It's now 8-7 to George, but I think we've touched on about Charles nearly getting pole position. Russell was looking pretty handy. He was purple in that middle sector until he had that bit of oversteer at turn 16 and then was late onto the throttle for 17. And you could say essentially you then carry that through 8 to 18, 19. And he was, 700ths off pole position? So I think possibly George could have been on pole position. And as Andrew said, don't rule him out for tomorrow. He's pretty handy at times of getting off the line. So I think we've got a really, really good scrap on our hands. And George is going to be gunning, isn't he? He's going to be wanting to get Mercedes their first win of this season. Lewis, yeah, he'll be disappointed. He's very good round here. Throwback to that amazing lap that he set, was it those years ago, 2018. But yeah, he doesn't seem particularly happy. But George, I think he's on a roll at the moment, but I wouldn't say that he's sort of streets ahead of Lewis and, stamping authority or that kind of stuff. It's just, we've seen it with Mercedes drivers, haven't we? One seems to be a little bit ahead of the other and vice versa.
I can see elbows out for George Russell going into turn 1. I think he wants this win and knows turn 1 is going to be a make or break for him.
Definitely, and don't forget last year, Leclerc was on pole, Perez was second. Perez got the jump at the start, got into the lead and never lost it. Now, on Hamilton, he's been saying that this isn't the first time he said this, by the way. He's been saying after qualifying that this Mercedes is the hardest car he's ever driven to get right. He's been talking all year about how he doesn't like the way it behaves. But he says he's really happy for George. They did a mega job. He's just been connected to the car all weekend. And on Russell's recent run, he's talked about it actually a number of times. He came back from the summer break into Zandvoort, and he was saying he'd had a mental reset. He thought he'd been overcomplicating things in the run of races leading up to the summer break, and he's gone back to basics. So basically, what he was saying was he was trying to reach too hard for things that weren't in the car, rather than just focusing on getting the best out of whatever the car was that weekend. He's changed that back to what you would normally do, which is the latter, since Zandvoort. And we've seen the results. It's really worked for him. But look, let's not rule Lewis Hamilton out. He's Lewis Hamilton at the end of the day.
Exactly.
P2 for George Russell then, and P5 for Lewis. It does strike me, though, that the end of Friday, both drivers in the Mercedes sort of very excitable about how the day had gone. And then a matter of hours later, and Lewis Hamilton really uncomfortable. Body language in the media pen, very irritable. And you can see he's really been struggling with that car. It does seem to chop and change so much. We talk about that with the Ferrari, with consistency. But the Mercedes also, there's been a tendency to sort of get hopes up after Friday and then things to change on a Saturday. Why is it changing so much from one day to the other?
Well, Rosanna, Toto Wolff has reused again that word diva that he used a few years ago about the previous spec of car. I can't remember, was it 2017 when
that was when it was winning, though. They used to use that in a sort of positive way.
Actually, that was it started in 2017 when Ferrari actually had the faster car for most of the year. And they were struggling to get on top of a new theory of design, Mercedes. Now, they're in a new theory of design again with this ground effect set of regulations. They've admittedly messed it up compared to Red Bull, and they're going to have to revisit that for next year. But that's what it's about. It's the Hamilton particularly has been saying it's so difficult to understand what the car's going to do. You can't predict it from corner to corner. You don't know. Trying to get confidence in the car has been their big problem, and sometimes you find it and sometimes you don't, and when he hasn't found it, Hamilton, he's found himself struggling, and looks like that's what he's been doing this weekend.
Well, he will line up behind Lando Norris in the McLaren. Upgrades for Lando this weekend, seeming to work well on his car, and then Oscar Piastri should get them next weekend in Japan. Behind Lewis is Kevin Magnussen, P6 for him in the Haas. A really good qualifying session for him, ahead of Fernando Alonso, P7, who said that he could have done lap after lap all night long and he wouldn't have improved. So P7 it is for the Aston Martin. Esteban Ocon, P8, ahead of Nico Hülkenberg, the second Haas, making it into Q3, P9 for him. And then P10 for Liam Lawson. We spoke about him a little earlier on, out-qualifying the two Red Bulls. What a moment for Liam, and potentially a chance to score some points in Formula One.
Bravo. But unfortunately, he will be picking up his P45 from Red Bull for knocking out Max Verstappen. So, it's been a nice ride for Liam Lawson. Fantastic. 7,000ths of a second, he pipped Verstappen in the top 10. And a mistake from his teammate Yuki Tsunoda in the end prevented him from getting into the top 10. Tsunoda was on course to get into the top 10 and out-qualify Lawson, but he locked up. We went back and actually watched the onboard footage to check and see why Tsunoda bailed on his final lap in the final sector, because he was looking to get into the top 8, really, I think it was. But he locked up in turn 14, visibly frustrated. You could see his helmet, not happy. So Tsunoda out-qualified by Liam Lawson in what only is third qualifying for Liam Lawson. The best qualifying result for that car. Up until that point, that car in the hands of Lawson, De Vries and Ricciardo was the only one in the entire field not to have gotten into Q3. And I think he's turning heads, Liam Lawson.
Yeah, he is.
As you say, bravo.
And everyone says that, you can use simulators to learn the track, but there's nothing like driving the track. Singapore's a hard circuit, he's not had a great deal of track time compared to Yuki, for example. If we're going to compare to teammates, Yuki's obviously raced here as well. So I think it's a really good job by Liam Lawson. As you say, we're turning some heads, and maybe, just maybe, is this going to crank up a little bit of pressure on Yuki Tsunoda? He probably thought the pressure was going to come from Daniel, but it turns out now that the pressure could be coming from Liam Lawson.
It's a really interesting situation developing at AlphaTauri, actually, Rosanna, because Daniel Ricciardo was brought back in because Nick De Vries hadn't been doing a good enough job as far as Helmut Marko and Red Bull were concerned. Now, part of bringing Ricciardo back was to benchmark Tsunoda, who'd looked really good against De Vries, but Red Bull still have their doubts about whether he's, worthy of a long-term Formula One career. I think they suspect that he probably isn't. Now, Liam Lawson is doing no good whatsoever for Yuki Tsunoda's longevity in Formula One. So, questions about Ricciardo, he'll probably be back within a couple of races. Could the AlphaTauri lineup next year be Lawson and Ricciardo, perhaps? Not Tsunoda and Lawson or Tsunoda and Ricciardo. There's a lot to go into the mix there. Lawson's really put himself in the frame.
Yeah, we know how Red Bull also can be quite brutal sometimes with their decisions. They shouldn't be held back with Nick De Vries booting him out, which I personally think was too early and a bit unfair. So, yeah, who knows? It might be, as you said, Andrew, a totally different lineup.
We will have to wait and see. Behind Liam Lawson, then it's Max Verstappen, as we've spoken about. Then Pierre Gasly, P12 in the Alpine, says they've been playing catch-up. Then Sergio Perez, P13. Alex Albon behind them in the Williams, always going to be a bit of a tricky one for them. Yuki Tsunoda, we've spoken about bailing out of laps, but said the car was feeling good. He might just have to enjoy the feeling of that car for as long as he gets in it. Valtteri Bottas, P16. Then Oscar Piastri, P17 for him, finding it difficult in Q1 with that crash from Lance Stroll, which we'll talk about in a moment. Logan Sargent P18, then Zhou Guanyu P19, and it was Lance Stroll who stopped the session in Q1. We talked about pressure when it comes to Red Bull, AlphaTauri, Liam Lawson, etc. Was this, Andrew, Lance Stroll feeling the pressure and binning the car? Obviously, there's been chatter in the paddock about Fernando Alonso outperforming him constantly and Lance being the weak link when it comes to where Aston Martin could be in the Constructors' Championship. Did it all get too much for Lance this evening?
Well, look, I can't speak for Lance Stroll, but it looks that way to me from the outside. You know, he's been dominated by Fernando Alonso, his teammate, all year. The first run in qualifying, Alonso was 8/10 faster than him. This is a track that Alonso usually excels at, so I think he'll be a little bit disappointed to be 7th. Says a lot, actually, for how Aston Martin have fallen back a little in the pecking order over the last few races. So Stroll goes into that last run in Q1. He was already going to be knocked out. He knew he had to try something. Alonso's shown him what the car's capable of. He got a little oversteer moment out of the last chicane, held it, but that will have spiked the temperature in his tyres. And then he's just asked too much of the car into the final corner with tyres that would have lost a little bit of grip. Maybe he's not accounted for that loss of grip, not thought about it enough. Why hasn't he thought about it enough? Maybe that's the pressure to deliver. You know, he's not under threat for his seat because his dad runs the team and he'll be in that car as long as he wants to be in that car. But it can't have been easy for Lance to have watched Alonso just destroy him all season. I mean, he's been beaten by every teammate apart from Sergei Sorokin throughout his Formula 1 career, but never to this extent. It's been an annihilation. That has to start taking a toll on any driver, even if your dad runs the team.
But it was always going to be tough, though, wasn't it, coming up against Fernando Alonso? So, without sounding too brutal, but what did he kind of expect in some ways? Did he think, you know what, I'm way better than him, I'm going to absolutely trounce him, I'm going to be way ahead of him? What did he expect? It was never going to be easy. You're up against Fernando Alonso. It was, but we know how they can work sometimes.
I love a Sergei Sorokin referral.
Throwback.
Remember him? Wow. I personally think we've had this discussion on air as well, and we can go down a full rabbit hole about Lance Stroll, Lawrence Stroll, and the Aston Martin situation. I personally think that there will come a time, if this continues, that Lance's and possibly Lawrence's position will shortly within that team and structure will become untenable at some point. There will be questions asked at board level when you've got one driver, one of the greatest Formula One has ever seen, delivering in and out and getting the maximum out of that car every time. They should be second, at the very least third in the Constructors. They are not.
But look, who's going to ask the question? Lawrence Stroll owns the team. But
surely there's board members.
Harry, it's his toy.
It's his money.
He can do what he wants.
Yeah.
Right? The question is, so let's not disappear down the rabbit hole, but just to sum up the situation, Lawrence Stroll wants Lance Stroll to be world champion in Formula One. I think that ambition, dream, whatever you want to call it, has finally been punctured this year. Alonso has, I think everybody in the world, apart from Lawrence Stroll, knew it already. But unless Lawrence Stroll is blind, he must know now that Lance Stroll is never going to be world champion unless he's got a car that's half a second a lap quicker than the rest of the field and a teammate who's slower than him, which, let's be honest, is not going to be easy to find. So then they have to start asking themselves existential questions, the Strolls. What's the team for? The team is for Lance. So if Lance doesn't want to drive anymore, or Lawrence doesn't see that he can achieve Lance's ambition, what then? In Formula One, the expectation is he'll sell the team, perhaps to Saudi Arabia, and walk away. But that's some way in the future. I don't know that that's going to happen. That's just what people are gossiping about. But, you know, that's what it comes down to. Board questions, forget it. It's Lawrence's toy. He does what he wants with it.
Brutal, but honest. And actually probably, well, you're right. You're right.
Maybe there'll be a coup in the Aston Martin board.
A business plan for him, how to sell it to the Saudis, and you need to take a little bit of a cut. There we go.
We'll never see Andrew Benson again. He'll be residing on an island somewhere probably near
Well, I
Mauritius.
hope we're
Seychelles.
invited, though.
Exactly, yeah. So a huge smash for Lance Stroll. He walked away, got out of the car unaided, and has been given the all clear from the medical centre. But a big job to get that car back together for tomorrow's race at Aston Martin. Right, simple question. Who's going to win the race, guys? Who wants to go first?
I'm going to go Carlos Sainz is going to win the race at the end of the Singapore Grand Prix.
I'm going to go last, see what everyone else says.
Oh, Alice, you're just passing the buck. Okay, Andrew.
George Russell.
Oh,
I agree with
Is
Andrew.
that what you wanted, Alice?
Max Verstappen.
Yeah, I knew you were
No,
going to say Verstappen.
no, I fancy George Russell as well to win the race tomorrow.
Who doesn't? All those topless tops.
All these
shots.
topless, yeah. That's why I said. That's why I added in the race because I saw your eyes, Andy, light up. Like, oh, do you now? There's some news. That's one way to end a podcast, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. It was a podcast. It's now turned into slapstick and a farce. But anyway, okay, well, we'll all have to wait and see who gets to that top step of the podium tomorrow evening. It's the Singapore Grand Prix. Carlos Sainz on pole ahead of George Russell and Charles Leclerc. Will that be the order they take the checkered flag? Hope you've enjoyed the podcast, guys. It's going to be an exciting one. Don't forget, you can join us and listen to live commentary across the BBC.